Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tim. This is another Real Ideal Gear review. Today we're looking at the Glycine vacuum. This is a vintage watch from the 1960s made through until the 1970s. And it was made by Glycine, obviously was the manufacturer, but there was the technology behind this actually has a really interesting history because this is a vacuum sealed watch, which means the watch has no air inside the case, underneath the crystal. There is no air whatsoever. There's no water vapor. There's nothing inside there except for the movement, which is kind of an interesting idea. There's some benefits to this, and there's some history behind this that's really fascinating. So we're going to talk about the history of this watch to start with. We'll get into the review of this vintage watch, which is phenomenal watch. I highly recommend looking for a Glycine vacuum watch out there. It is a very interesting technology that goes into this watch. So let's get started with the history and then we'll get into the review. The history of the Glycine vacuum watch is interesting. To say the least, it's interesting. It reaches all the way back to the 1920s with William Hamilton. There was a patent that was granted to Hans Ulrich Klingenberg, who was the author of the monoblock vacuum sealed watch case. Cartier in 2015 made their own vacuum sealed watch that allegedly had a 32-hour power reserve as a result of removing the air out of the case. There's all kinds of interesting history that goes along with just this one idea. So let's start back in 1921 with William Hamilton. He was a railway engineer and he designed what was called the short synchrotome. The short synchrotome used the idea of taking the pendulum clock and putting the pendulum inside of a sealed vacuum chamber. By removing the air out of the chamber, the pendulum doesn't pass through any air, therefore reducing the friction greatly, increasing not only the power reserve, but also the accuracy. If you've ever seen the YouTube video clips where you have a physics professor holding a bowling ball tied to a string up to a student's nose, and they let the ball go, it goes out, comes back, but it doesn't come all the way back to the student's nose. It comes just short of the student's nose. Every time it comes back a little bit less and less. That's the idea. There's two things at play actually in that experiment. One is gravity is working against the pendulum going up on either side of the swing, but there's also friction. There's friction in the air that the bowling ball is passing through. So the same idea applies to this vacuum sealed pendulum on a clock. Remove the air, you remove some of the friction, you increase the accuracy, increase the power reserve. Another interesting and very important part to explaining the vacuum sealed watch is there is no need to screw down or screw in the case back, or in this case, you don't have to worry about the crystal, because the pressure on the inside of the watch is zero, and the pressure on the outside of the watch is whatever the air pressure is at that elevation. Magdeburg hemispheres is another good example. Look this up on Wikipedia or on YouTube, and you can see what was used back in the 17th century, about 1654. He developed this experiment where he took two hemispheres, put them together, sealed them with grease, and was able to evacuate the air out from the inside of the hemispheres. His hemispheres were about 50 centimeters in diameter, generating approximately 2.2 tons of force holding those two hemispheres together. He hooked up two teams of horses and could not pull those two hemispheres apart. Now, this vacuum-sealed Glycine watch is about 3 centimeters in diameter, which means there's approximately 250 pounds of force pressing the back side of this case, the case back, up against the case. So this is something you really got to keep in mind when it comes down to the technology and the benefits of vacuum sealing a watch. You actually are leveraging the atmospheric pressure to hold things together. This short synchrotome clock was the most accurate clock on the planet until the quartz arrival in the 1970s. Now, fast forward to 1960, Hans Ulrich Klingenberg, a salesman for Glycine, developed and received a patent for the vacuum-sealed watch case. When he got that patent, he also developed a company called the Vacuum Chronometer Corporation. This corporation developed and manufactured these cases for the likes of Glycine, Croton, Waltham, Longines, Fortis, and also his own company later developed or started in 1966, 1967 called the Century Watch Corporation. He was fascinated with accuracy, and so his watches that he developed were chronometer certified or COSC certified. And to do that, he would send in the entire watch after it was all assembled, which was highly unusual. Most companies would send in the movement, get the movement COSC certified, then they would just receive it back, and then they would manufacture or assemble that movement into the watch. Why don't we see vacuum sealed watches today? Mostly because the quartz movement burst the bubble of this development in the 1960s and early 70s. The quartz movement was much more accurate than any mechanical watch that was out there. It just overshadowed everything. So really this was the fault of timing, not necessarily the technology itself. So what is the impact of this development on watches? Well, in 2015, Cartier developed a watch called the ID2. This watch was also a vacuum sealed watch. An homage of sorts, if we're getting into the homage argument. This is an homage to the vacuum sealed watch of the 1960s. But the Cartier ID2 was known to have a power reserve of 32 days, an incredible amount of time, and mostly due to a vacuum sealed watch where the balance wheel is not passing through air, so the balance wheel takes less energy to move it, which means there's less energy necessary from the mainspring, and from there, it just all cascades into a much longer power reserve and, frankly, a more accurate watch. So when I purchased this watch, I sent an email out to a Century Watch Group and asked them if they could help me identify what year this watch was manufactured. I got a reply back from the grandson, Sundar Klingenberg, who basically gave me a bunch of the information that I've just shared with you. And there was really no way to determine the year that this watch was manufactured because there was a decade of time where they were doing the cases and the vacuum sealing for a bunch of companies, including Glycine. So as far as the date goes or the year goes, as it relates to the manufacturer of the watch that I have, it's basically a 1960s watch. Now let's take a look at the Glycine vacuum watch. We know this watch was manufactured somewhere in the 1960s. We know it's a vacuum sealed watch, which means it has, consequentially, it has typically a higher power reserve. It maintains its accuracy longer. The maintenance interval is definitely longer. The recommended maintenance interval for this watch was anywhere between 8 to 10 years. So let's go over the 5 things we typically go through. We're going to go through them a little differently because this is a vintage watch that's about 60 years old. So we're not going to get too nitpicky about the way that the watch looks now because obviously it's not new and it has it has a lot of wear on it. So starting off with the size. The dimensions of this watch are 35 millimeters across as far as the diameter is concerned. The proportions related to this are perfect. The height off the wrist, the lug to lug, the width of the lugs, all great. This watch really looks fantastic as far as the proportions go. It's a lightweight watch. It's not a dive watch. It is a stainless steel case, but it's a lightweight watch. It does not have the mass that some of these other watches have when it comes down to plus 100 meters of water resistance. So this watch is actually rated for 180 meters of water resistance. And with that in mind, you almost assume that there's going to be more mass to this watch. Now, the reason being is, again, you have a vacuum sealed watch. When you try to maintain the vacuum seal, you're preventing gases from getting into the case. The molecules of gases are much smaller than water molecules are. So you have to have a much better system of maintaining that vacuum seal, which in that case inherently keeps water out of the case. The mesh bracelet is like warm butter on the wrist. I mean, it just passes over the top of the wrist and around the wrist. It just hugs the wrist. It is one of the best. It is the best mesh bracelet I have ever worn. And it doesn't pull any hair. It's just a joy to wear. The clasp is also incredible. It has the typical kind of hook bar clasp. So on the one part of the strap, you have the base, which has the bar. And the other side of the strap, you have the hook and the fold over, enclosure. So you put the hook onto the bar. And then when you do that, there is a secondary hook, so to speak, that goes over the first hook that puts more added pressure and kind of closes the hook around the bar, which actually prevents that hook from coming off the bar. When I first got the watch, I opened up the clasp and I saw the hook there. And I was like, okay, I just pulled, move it forward a little bit and slide it off the bar. Couldn't do that. Then I noticed that there was a little tab. And so I put my fingernail under there and popped the tab up. I was like, oh, there's a double hook on here. So that secondary hook really puts added pressure onto the first hook, which keeps it retained right off the bat. So the clasp on this watch is very unique. I've never seen this before, but I really like it a lot. You'll also notice on the case back that there are no screws. There's nothing that you would use a case back remover to grab. I'm not aware of anything that pops the case back up off the case itself. So for me, when I look at this, maintaining this watch, it's like I'm not exactly sure how to get the case back off. And if it's vacuum sealed, it's going to take a lot of energy to pull that off. Going back to the history, when you have the atmospheric pressure that holds everything together is higher than you would ever imagine. So this may actually be a watch I have to find a watch watchmaker that actually knows what they're doing when it comes to a vacuum sealed watch. So the finish of the watch, the case is really unique. It's 1960s. It actually has a little bit of, I think, Art Deco into it because there's this flat bezel that goes all the way around the top side of the case. And it has kind of a stepped appearance because you have the acrylic crystal that comes up in a trapezoidal type angle. So you kind of get the sensation that there is a stepped case to this, kind of a hallmark of Art Deco. But you have an acrylic crystal on here, which is fantastic. I did use a little poly watch on here to remove some of the scratches. The dial is this champagne gold colored dial that I just absolutely love. There's some very faint but very thin grid lines on there that kind of give it a little bit of a sector dial look to it, kind of vintage 1960s, but also kind of lends a little bit back to the 1920s. The hour markers on here are great, single faceted, applied markers. The 12, 6, and 9 are large. They're very differentiated. The rest of the hour markers are kind of small little pips that go around, which is fantastic. The date window, I love it. The date itself is easy to read. It's larger than the typical date when it comes down to the size of the numbers on the inside. It's also 60 years old, so the background of the date window or the date wheel is a little bit of a faded white. So yeah, the contrast is not quite as high. The text on the dial, minimal. Glycine and vacuum, also very thin, very subdued when it comes down to just, it kind of fades into the background. So the color scheme of this watch, the mesh bracelet, the case design, the acrylic crystal, the crown itself, just a great overall design. One comment about the crown, it's a little bit hard to grab onto because that bezel sticks out just a little bit. If you look at the side profile of the case, the side of the case, the mid case, actually is trapezoidal in shape, or it's not at a right angle or perpendicular to the top or bottom of the case. It actually has kind of a receding case from the top down to the bottom of the case. It kind of angles in a little bit. So that means that the crown is a little bit hard to grab onto. So in the 0 position, that's where you wind the watch. As you're turning the crown, your thumb kind of gets pushed off, or your fingers kind of get pushed a little bit further out on the crown because of the top of the case. But overall, I think it's the crown itself I like it a lot. There's a single position crown, so when you pull the crown out, you can adjust the time. It's a non-hacking movement, which you kind of get used to it. That's a 1960s watch, right? It is not a quick set date, so you have to turn the hands all the way around to get the date set, so it can be kind of cumbersome that way. The movement on the inside is an ETA 2638. Right now, I think it's at plus 6 seconds per day. So it kind of went up and down. It was from 6 up to 9, went back down to 6. So there's a little bit of variability. I'm not exactly sure what's going on there, but it's stuck around 6 seconds per day for a long time. There is a little bit of lume in here. The handset, the hour hand, the minute hand have a little bit of lume on there. And what was interesting, when I charged it up with my UV light, I saw that there was some lume dust on the dial. It almost looked like it was a galaxy kind of a thing, like the Milky Way. You know, when you look at the Milky Way, kind of this like galactic dust between the 2 o'clock hour marker and the center pinions. Water resistance is about 100 meters of water resistance. The watch is 60 years old. Do I trust that? No. I'm going to maintain this watch in my mind as kind of a 50-meter water resistance. Good for hand washing. I'm not going to take it swimming. It's just not that. It really isn't. Uses for this watch are definitely casual to formal. I think you can pull off formal because it's such a simple looking watch. It's very elegant. It has kind of just subdued colors. You've got that champagne gold dial. You've got a nice shiny mesh bracelet, so you've got plenty of flash. You've got polished case, simple look to it. I really think it does hit that formal mark pretty well, but I think it also goes all the way back to casual. It is a sport watch type look to it too. So it's not that total formal dress watch look. It really does have a more sporty feel to it. It's a very comfortable watch to wear. Do I recommend this watch? 100%. If you can find one out there that has a good movement, it has keeps good time, 100% I think you're going to enjoy this. It is such a classy looking 1960s style watch with a little bit of 1920s thrown in there, if you ask me. So there's the review. I'd love to hear back from you if you've heard of the Glycine vacuum watch, if you've heard of any vacuum watches. Now remember, there's a number of companies out there that were having the Vacuum Chronometer Corporation build them a vacuum sealed case with the likes of Fortis, Longines, Croton, Waltham, Glycine. All these companies were contracting that out. So there's some watches out there. I just haven't seen any, and that's why I'm just kind of scratching my head like this this has to be more common than it is. So if you've got that out there, let me know about that. I'm really curious about that from you guys. So there you go. That's the review for this watch. I hope you enjoyed it. My name's Tim. This has been another Real Ideal Gear review. We'll catch you guys next time.